Hey, how's it going?
It's going. Can you do me a favor? Can
Yes,
you pronounce your name in full?
sure. My name is Rainier Meningding.
Okay. And how would you describe yourself in terms of racial, ethnic background?
Filipino American.
Okay, cool. And I'm Saira, as you know. And I thought you'd
Correct.
appreciate how much of a failed Asian I am. I just totally fucked up rice in the rice cooker. And seriously,
Well, you have the whole quarantine to learn.
I do in 45 years. So I don't want to take up too much of your time. I kind of just want to get into it if you don't mind.
Definitely.
So I want to read you, I'm sure you've already read this, but I want to read you um, this quote. Hold on, let me pull it up. Let me just, all right, I'm going to start from the beginning. Hang on. All right, I want to read you a quote from Andrew Yang, who I know you supported, right, in
hmm
his presidential bid.
hmm
And I want to also preface Andrew's a friend of mine, and I did not support his presidential run.
hmm
Okay. We Asian Americans need to embrace and show our Americanness in ways we never have before. We need to step up, help our neighbors, donate gear, vote, wear red, white, and blue, volunteer, fund aid organizations, and do everything in our power to accelerate the end of this crisis. Demonstrate, hold on, after calling on fellow Asian Americans to, quote, show without a shadow of doubt they were also American, Yang wrote, quote, demonstrate that we are part of the solution. We are not the virus, but we can be part of the cure. What do you think about that? Trying to, as an Asian American, that you need to really prove your Americanness.
Frustrating. One of the problems with that narrative of, in order for us to receive better treatment, we need to be outstanding, and we need to, you know, uh, engage ourselves in 300 hours of community service. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work. The actions of many heroic Asian Americans have happened throughout our time in the United States, and it's not as if any of that has really had an impact on anyone doing racism at the in relation to coronavirus. No one's like, oh my gosh, I remember that amazing Asian person in my community that did this thing, so let me not target you. Yeah, I'm disappointed.
I mean, it strikes me as not just for me, again, as someone who is his friend, not just disappointing, but also reinforcing white supremacy.
hmm
Um, let's use sort of the most salient example here of Barack Obama.
hmm
Nobody is more American than the American president, right?
hmm
And he's a black man. Did that eradicate racism against black people? Of course not. I mean, it doesn't even make
Exactly.
any sense. It reinforces white supremacy. It doesn't even make any sense as a practical and intellectual matter,
hmm
and it's dangerous. And that is what makes me very nervous that Andrew Yang is the voice of Asian Americans right now. To be honest with you. Um, so I guess I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how are you feeling? You know, being on the receiving end. I'll tell you, like post 9/11, South Asian Americans, dark skinned South Asian Americans, Muslims, and Muslim presenting folks were super targeted because America has a long history of all white America has a long history of scapegoating non-white America for whatever it is, right?
hmm
I mean, I lived in New York City. I was at the World Trade Center that day. I lived through it and it was horrifying. I was called every name in the book and it's continued, right?
hmm
I'm South Asian, so I'm not on the direct receiving end of the
hmm
anti-Asian racism that's happening right now. You are, right? Like your Filipino American people are. Um, so can you just talk about that a little bit?
So what's kind of fascinating about my experience, especially with a lot of Filipinos, is um, a lot of Filipinos have been the target of coronavirus related racism, but there are a lot of us who have sort of uh, uh, been able to avoid that, in the sense that for so long we've been excluded from East Asian communities. If you're looking at the hierarchy
Mm-hmm.
within Asian communities and within those dynamics, for to this day, Filipinos are um, looked down upon
Yeah.
in East Asia. They're treated as if, um, in the same way that white Americans treat Latino laborers, they treat Filipino laborers the same way. And so in this very weird scenario where there's this elevated racism directed towards East Asians, a lot of Filipinos are sort of left on the sidelines thinking, like, what does it mean to be Asian? Like, we're not on the receiving end of this, but there's also still some of our community members who are. And so I think my perspective is to just um, try to share some of the stories that a lot of the East Asian people are going through, but also to um, remind a lot of people that um, you know the racism that is going on during the coronavirus. Hopefully, this will pass, but I hope more East Asians can understand that the experiences that are happening right now are sort of the lived everyday experiences that so many other brown Asians have had to endure through. And it isn't my way of trying to say like, oh, you know, we have to deal with this all the time, so you guys can just you have to suck it up. Like, I think all of that is terrible, but I think it's an opportunity for us to look at the fact that we are all in this boat, and maybe we might not be in this boat. Maybe Filipinos might not be as big of a player in this particular boat, but um, it should be a call to arms to all Asian Americans that it any time could be your time. No one predicted that this was going to happen, and not only is this happening to Asian Americans, but it's happening to Asians on a global scale. And so it's going to be fascinating to see the way East Asians reconcile with their Asian identities and how close they are willing to align with the white communities.
Okay, so much to unpack there. Number one, I guess I want to speak even just from a place of living in Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you, white ass Colorado can't tell the difference between, you
Oh
know,
yeah.
so there are certainly Filipino Americans in Colorado who are being targeted because white
Mm-hmm.
Americans can't
Mm-hmm.
tell the difference. We all look alike, right?
Of course.
Um, and that's number one. You just hit the nail on the head, though. And that's really what I wanted to talk to you about. Like, it's really interesting because South Asians have fallen out with East Asians because East Asians don't want to be associated
Mm-hmm.
with South Asians.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're the dirty Muslims here. They don't want that. So something that has really struck me in the past few weeks is a lot of East Asians are rightly talking about the xenophobic violence, and it is violence. I mean, people are getting beaten up, killed,
Stabbed. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
this is real stuff. And what I'd like to say, it's what you just said. At some point, it's your turn, right?
Mm-hmm.
This time, it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what about saying to East Asians in America, keep this level of anger
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to anti-Blackness and
Mm-hmm.
anti-Indigenous violence, because Black people and Indigenous people in this country, white Americans sustain violence throughout,
Mm-hmm.
and for the
Mm-hmm.
rest of us, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, we've seen this with the Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese internment.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, back at the turn of the 20th century, the bubonic plague that hit Chinatown and San Francisco, it's sort of an apples to apples comparison. Massive
Mm-hmm.
violence against Chinese Americans at that time. But what happens to the Asians when things settle down? We go back to what you just said. We got to reconcile our relationship with whiteness. And what this tells me is we have to start fighting against all racism and really dig in to fighting against anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous violence within our own communities, but
Mm-hmm.
also at large. And I just want to know where the Asians are when Black people get killed by the police and Indigenous people go missing and get killed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's the thing that a lot of people on my page have been talking about. A lot of activists who are saying, we recognize everything that is going on and it's terrible. We recognize that it's violence. But when you're talking about the years that Black and brown communities have been advocating, that have been talking about the need to boycott organizations like the NFL, the need to stand up against anti-Black violence. And so often there were so many Asians who felt that, well, I don't have a horse in that race and I don't have to worry about that. And I had been beating the same drum over and over and over again that if you look at our history, there are moments in time, I mean, obviously there are those huge overarching moments like the Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese internment, but there are so many moments freckled within those decades, like the murder of Vincent Chin, um, the treatment of Filipino veterans. Like there are just so many cases where every single group of Asian American has been targeted for some sort of systemic discrimination or violence. And my lesson is history, unfortunately, in this country, is always going to repeat itself. You know, there are narratives about Asian people that have originated from the late 1800s that still ring true today. A lot of
Absolutely.
the sort of the a lot of this yellow peril fear of Asian people goes to, it's more than just, oh, Asian people have coronavirus, but it's this belief that they are not just dirty but genetically dirty, that they're biologically dirty, that there is something that is impure about them, that they worry that coming into contact
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
Asian people will
Yeah.
somehow, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
get them infected.
No, this is like you said, it's history repeating itself.
Hmm.
And with Race to Dinner, a big piece of why Regina and I are the right match.
Hmm.
She's a Black woman. She's lived through Jim Crow. I'm the model minority, you know,
Hmm.
and I came post 1965 Immigration Act, is to show the intersectionality and that Black and brown have to stand together against white supremacy,
Hmm.
and we
Hmm.
cannot turn on each other. And it's even more to me than just Asians standing up when there is white violence against Black and brown people. It's Asians standing up against our own violence
Hmm. Oh yeah,
against Black
100%.
people and Indigenous people. And that to me, I mean, I will say that, and it really is upsetting to me. I can't tell you the deluge of Asians in my social media timelines, Twitter and Facebook, again, rightfully calling out the violence, upset. And when I will say, let's keep up the same level of anger and animosity. By the way, violence against Black people and Indigenous people has not dropped.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's not like it's gone away. And then it's largely crickets. You know,
Hmm.
it's largely crickets. And so if we cannot figure out a way to have solidarity, this will just keep happening. It will just
Exactly,
keep happening.
exactly. And I think a lot more Asians need to understand that this isn't a phase. This isn't a transformation of like, oh my gosh, you know, America's now racist. You know, a lot of people sort of had that impression, a similar impression after Donald Trump got elected. But it was more that an event happened and it gave people an opportunity to express feelings and emotions that they've already had. Um, like you said, more Asians also need to start speaking out about discrimination and racism against Asian people, and across the board. You know, we need more East Asians to speak up about what is happening to, um, you know, South and Southeast Asians. You know, if we're talking about Asian American issues, I think one of the funniest things that happened post Donald Trump, him winning, was during this discussion of immigration, I didn't see a lot of Asian Americans talking about the fact that these immigration reforms would also impact Southeast Asians, and that there were millions of um, uh, cases of Asian Americans who also were undocumented, and a lot of people weren't talking about these different issues, and they were continuing this narrative that the way to improve Asian American images was to increase visibility and representation, but
Andrew
you,
Yang is saying.
exactly. And that's the thing that's really frustrating, is that you can't win that war by only trying to illuminate all the greatness and the good. You also have to be willing to look at the bad parts and say, hey, we need to lift these communities up and we need to do something.
Absolutely. And I guess I can't like say it enough. You know, we've actually lived through this. September 11th was not that long. I mean, it was 20 years ago, right? But like,
Mm-hmm.
we've seen this, right?
Oh, uh-huh, uh-huh.
And we've demonized what in the past 3 years? We've demonized the Latinx community.
Mm-hmm.
Where has the Asian outrage been against the concentration camps?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and by the way, what's happening to the people inside the concentration camps? So it's also like, let's scream out about the violence that's happening against our communities now. but we have to see how the big picture is white supremacy, and we have to figure out this intersectionality, because if we don't, it will just keep happening. And by the way, now everybody is a target in this country besides white people, and white
Oh,
people
of
are also
course.
going to die from coronavirus, but like basically everybody is. And if we cannot reconcile this amongst ourselves, I just feel like we're screwed.
And that's sort of the silver lining of this is I hope this becomes a wake up call for a lot of Asian Americans to realize that we are in a position where we can bind together and be more politically engaged, and we can stand up and we can go ahead and talk about these things, and we have to be able to keep that same energy and make sure that whatever frustrations we feel about the racism happening to our communities, we need to apply that same pressure to other communities that are targets of violence.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you for talking to me,
Thanks. Thanks for having me on.
and stay safe, and I'll talk to you soon.
Definitely. Take care.
Bye.